Formscapes, Flowscapes and Mindscapes. Cosmology of forms, changes and minds, or consciousness. We saw before that the point can be thought of as the first unit of beingness, appearing on the contrasting background of relative emptiness or relative otherness. So the point can be expanded by zooming in or by its own unfolding expansion, or it can be reduced and eventually disappear and blend into the background, the way it would if you were moving away from space and seeing all the details at all the various scales disappear until eventually the Earth is just one unit and you move away from the Earth. Earth and Moon appear, then they appear as one unit, and then they disappear entirely in the background of space. So the same thing can apply in any direction. You zoom into the Earth and it becomes a world. Then any detail of this world can become a universe of its own. That's what you see in the old videos like Power of 10 or things like this. So it's the principle of scaling, different scales. And with the picture, the analogy of scales, you have this idea of a changing point of view. You can distance yourself and see something in a broader point of view, or you can get closer to something, then get on your knees and get to the scale of this thing, the way you would practically in movies like I can't remember the title, but you basically shrunk to the scale of bacteria or something and sent into the body. These ideas of scales would already apply to the becoming of a point. Other aspects of becoming that you find with points will be the moving of a point. So this is practical applications of you get any physical point of your body and you move it front, back, up, down. So I've shown this in other videos. But now what will interest us is that so that you can move something, it needs to move relative to something else. So when the background is relative emptiness, there's nothing to move towards. You need reference point to establish a frame of reference. And this frame of reference will allow movement towards something. If you move in a completely featureless and empty space, your position and the next position are absolutely equivalent, they're the same. So you need to establish other points to differentiate. And you cannot only differentiate on an infinite background. If you picture an empty sheet of paper, you can put a black dot on the sheet of paper and you have created a strong contrast and differentiation that will make the dot and the sheet of paper appear relative to each other. And then if the sheet of paper appears on a table or something, and at the edge you will see another differentiation into another scale of background. So these would be shifting backgrounds. But the overall overarching background of most cosmology starts with the absolute relative emptiness and the point of singularity, the point of creation. the point of origination of existence, being out of, being away from, originating from. So the point can now be reproduced, produced again. The same processes that gave birth or gave rise or originated this point can be reapplied to give other points. The point as a non-dimensional object, or with just the dimension of existence, cannot really be contrasted to other points. So these other points would be similar, self-similar in many ways. But already from the fact that the first point appears in a universe where the background is all prevalent, and the second point, the point that's reproduced or created again, recreated, appears from a world where you have already a point, creates the first basis of differentiation. There are not the matrix of conditions that surround the appearing of a point is not the same. So this will have implications later. It could be thought as a theoretical basis for all differentiation. But now we take focal points, for instance, practical use of reproduction or multiplication of points for perception. So I focus on one aspect, say one of the pictures in the background, and I can see them on the screen, and either I aim at it and look at it and focalize there, so I bring all my awareness, all my spies are getting into this part of the map to explore and get information about it. So now I can also do the same by not actively moving my line of sight. I could just bring my attention more to something. So I picture the entire screen, and without changing my gaze, I bring more curiosity, more interest, and more attention to what's happening on one of the picture. And then I can split this attention into, I take 2 points. So say the map closes to both windows, the picture and map. And now I actively move my attention towards them. So that's a continuous movement of decentralization. Decentralization is the term we use when we shift from one center to several, and you could use 1 center, 2 centers, 3 centers. Center is in some ways is an equivalent of a point ID in relation to periphery. So if you have no concept of periphery, no concept of inner medium, of border and of beyond or outer or other, then you will seldom see the concept of center applied. But now from this 2 points we could get to 3 points. I had another one of the pictures, and I tried to spread my attention. I divert part of my spies to explore these 3 territories. So obviously if you have your full supply of spies and you send them into just one area, you'll get to know this area faster or better. You have more information on less surface, less volume, or less objects. If I divert it to several other points of inquiry, then obviously I will get less. I will get less information on more objects, more space. So in some ways you could use this concept developed in the integral theory of depth and width. If I bring many people, I can explore in depth one area. If I distribute them, I can spread the width and get more shallow in some ways. So this, now if you picture, I start to see all four pictures, paintings behind me at the same time. I'm starting to draw a line that's interrupted. There are small gaps in between. The more and more points I'll put in between, the more I get to a continuous line of inquiry. So now this line would be horizontal and fairly regular. So the becoming of the point getting into the line's axis is a process of multiplication or reproduction. And it could be seen as punctual reproduction. You could do dots one after the other and create a line, whatever the shape of a line. Or you can get the same idea but with a continuous flow. So point spreads into another point, which spreads into another point. The actual rendition in the end will be nearly the same. The way it is done and the implications behind would change. So same. The point ID will give this notion of punctuality, puncture of something happening in one go, without direct continuity and without direct fluidity getting into the sequence. One go, one event, stop, getting into another event, stop, disconnect from the relationality with the background, reappearance, recreation, or relation to the background, sticking to it, and events happening continuously in the background. Even the idea of continuity will get us back again and again to this notion of point. The continuity can be broken down into single elements, single pieces, single units of time, single units of space, single units of beingness, of matter, of energy, of information. Or they can get explored in the continuous flow. And these again are two of the three different ways that are explicited by the title. So the study of the world as points or separate, distinct and punctual elements is related to the formscapes, landscapes of forms. I use several forms, several dots to create a picture. I light these various pixels on the screen and my picture appears. Or it could relate to the flows. And the flows are nearly exactly the same, but now instead of picturing these billion points being reproduced or multiplied, I will create a sequence of change, a linear sequence of change without interruption, a continuous sequence. And this way you'd get into drawing. So now instead of having a punctual sequence of dots, I will have sequence of lines, because most of the time the line will be interrupted somewhere, or it could be that the line is not interrupted. Some drills of drawing will do that. The third aspect would be, so the point will symbolize the elements and relate to materiality, to forms. The flowing lines will represent the energy, the flows, the movements, the actions. And the design, the overall picture, the plan, the imagination will represent so all the potentialities that can be expressed on the page, and all the relationality of these potentialities to movements and then to matter will relate to what we call mind, consciousness, that with which we know. I know, as we saw, with my beingness, the subject of the process of knowing. I know with my tools of perception, my tools of learning, but I know also with the content. So I know with the source, subject, the will, the origin that must be fed this information. I know with the action of knowing, or the action of perceiving. I know with the tools or objects or methods that I use to know. My senses, the various technological tools that I can use to expand them. And I know with the content that is known. If you remove the content, although you have all the rest, you will have nothing. So the content is also that with which I know. The content is also consciousness. So the dot that's expanding is also self-similar to my consciousness of the dot expanding. The expansion happens only if there's something that can perceive it from the inside or from the outside. So the idea of growth of matter, whatnot, without expansion of minds, information, what is same, it's difficult to extricate in actual life. It can be used like any other thing. In the mental realm, we can shift things all around the way we want. In practical applications, it will be a bit more difficult. So now let's get to lines. A line can be straight, it can be curved with one or several curves, so it can be undulated, it can be irregular, it can be going in different directions. The idea of direction comes from the relationship between one dot and one point of reference, or a series of points of reference. So what can we do with a line? We can expand the line. First thing, what can we do with a line? We can align. So you have several points here on your body, and some of these points will be misaligned. Say, if I take my hand, you get one point here, one point there, another point here. So now if I stretch one way or two ways, I can make the points align here with gravity. If I do the same with my spine, just by stretching from the fontanelle vertex of the cranium, or from the coccyx, or both at the same time, and stretching from the extremities, or stretching out from the inside. So one could be called extension, and the other one would be pushing out, so it could be an expulsion, expression. The idea of the alignment can be pictured with target practice. You have one point which would be my sight. Then the first object aligned with my sight. And already you could see first object aligned with the sight of the camera. So if an object nearly disappears or shows the least amount of spread, of width, it will be more closely aligned. See, I aligned both hands, and now I try to align with the camera. So if you picture someone looking from upwards, downwards, sideways, you align with this perception by making all the points disappear one after the other, if they're the same size. If they're different sizes, then you align by having at least part of them disappear. If it should be balanced, then you have one object, one small object, one bigger object, small thing here, and this here. So I should be able to see as much upwards and downwards in both directions if I want to center something. So the lines can be used to depict any sequence. We saw that continuous series of dots will create a line. We use lines to depict points in time, for instance, with the idea of a continuation and of a flow. So that's what we see with the timelines. Same as what we saw with points, we can explore the practical analogies and the various fields in which you will find ways to see the lines, so these units of form lines, or the units of forms that we call points. You can see them differently by expanding into many other disciplines, many other application realms. The points are called, you find the same word in applications like points of view, making a point. So this would be a focal centralization of the mind, for instance, on a specific unit of ID, or on one subject, one unit of will, of intentionality. And it could be the same for perception, like point of view. I centralize my perception from one place in space, one period in time, one unit of personality, one unit of identity, and the filters that define it, and that will give me this idea of point of view. And same, you could find many different applications. So lines, sometimes as we mentioned with points, the words will change. So dot is not the same word as a point, although the translation in another language of dot, in French for instance, would be point. So you could see by weaving through languages how some cultures will use the same word for something. Sometimes it's when you explore practical analogies, exploring, you do not always discover something very, very meaningful. In some ways you would, but it's not always meaning what you would like it to mean. So you explore the language and you discover that a word like point is used in other languages like French for some applications where in English you'd use another name. It is another way, another path to explore. It is not a strict answer. It's not a direct link to something practical, for instance, or to something meaningful more than practical. Because practical, the fact that you can use something so that you can apply it to energy doesn't make it more important than the fact that you can understand it or perceive it or make sense of it or become aware or conscious of it, which relate to the mindscapes and consciousness. And this is not more important in some ways than its beingness, its matter, its form. All three are woven together inextricably. Infinity of information without energy and form is the infinite knowing of emptiness, vacuity, void. You know everything because there is nothing to know. Out of this knowledge you cannot do or change anything. The doing without the knowledge or without the being. So beingness would be a unit of punctual unit of stability. There's a conservation there. The idea that something is fixed in time. It's not changed right away. While the perception of movement implies constant change at one level or another. Well, to summarize, these punctual linear ideas, continuous ideas, multilinear or strata shapes that you could see, they all relate to the shapes that give rise to the practical analogy. You take a line and you close it on itself and you create a cycle in time, or you create a circle in space. Now, once I have created a circle, I have created the idea, potential of tangential relationship to a flat line with one or few points of contact and the change of a point of contact in a continuous series. So I've invented the concept of rolling, whichever direction I use it. So the linearity allows for the extension in time, in space. It would allow for the compression or contraction. Now, obviously, if I contract this line, it will fold due to the elasticity of the object I'm using. but this also gives us stretching. I get to the idea of elasticity. Elasticity means that the stress that's applied to the material will release and bring the material back to its original shape or configuration as soon as I stop applying the stress. If the stress is too strong, it will reach a point of tear. So that's the Hooke's modulum for materials, and this idea applies to everything later. And it's good to start to weave it into our stories because it will have many implications. You have this idea of static beingness. Then elasticity is the property of recovering state. Static beingness is a idea of complete conservation of whatever state, whatever aspect you're mentioning. And elasticity is the ability of taking in change, getting forces applied to something, and then being able to get back to the point of reference, like this, the state of reference, when the stress is stopped and the application of stress is cancelled. Plasticity is a change in the state, like the reference point of the state, due to the force applied. So there's one elastic, I stretch it, it gets back into place, I stretch it again, it gets back into place for a while. After a while, or if I stretch it too much, it will become loose. And now I went from elastic deformation to plastic deformation. So I changed the normal state of the form. I stretch it again, and then I reach the point of tear. So I'm tearing the fabric at its weakest link, and it starts to give. I tear it again, more and more, so I stretch it from a point of tearing, and then at one point there's the rupture point. So one thing has turned into two separate. So this can be applied to the idea of a line that can be stretched into infinity, but by stretching at one point it could also create tearing points, then rupture points, and get from one line to several lines. The line, if it's continuous, can be one, closing on itself, defining a unit of interiority and exteriority brought together by the relationality of a border. Definition is the same name. Definis in Latin was the bone, like the small markers you'd put to actually define a border. So if I put many small points of definition of a border close together, I get this continuous line that I can call a border at one scale. If we relate it to IDs, I would call it the definition. I define what's inside as different from what's outside. The word will mean what's there. It's the set of uses of a word, and what's outside will be like improper use of a word, or it could be a stretching of the use of a word if it's close to the border. And now what we can do with lines. let's get back to practical applications. So the point allowed for concentration, distribution, peripheral movement, centering movement. Then it allowed, once we establish several points of reference, getting closer, getting away from maintaining distance. And when we established the axis of movement in space, movement forward, back, up, down, side, side. These exist as they exist in the most pragmatic and practical meaning, but they also exist. You find them oftentimes in say esoteric literature. The vertical movement would relate to this idea of scales and would relate to this hierarchy or holarchy of levels. So this the Earth at the scale of the Sun is just a dot. At the scale of the universe, it's non-appearing. It's a part of a part of a part of a part. So the same idea could be used as the overarching or the designation of the highest vertical level you could think of, is one of the meaning we could give to the name God in some cultures. So the mono God, monotheistic God, is just the unity of beingness. Appearing, so it's like this dot of beingness appearing on the relative emptiness, or this dot of definite, finite, definite, or manifested appearing on the background of the infinite, indefinite, or infinite potential unmanifested. So this is one of the way you can see a designation that would baffle some of the modern minds. Translated. Translation is betrayal. Traducire is translation is treason. Treason. That's the old quote would apply there. Obviously, if you say to someone to a religious person that he worships the unified field of information or unified field of consciousness, you're not making you're translating something into a different culture with different categories. And although in some aspect it could make sense, especially for you, if you try to understand or comprehend what others do or what others think, you need these translations. You create, through translations, you create commonalities. If you confuse the commonalities you find with a complete identity or a similarity, then you lose the difference and uniqueness of each narrative of a world, is each perspective of a world. And it's not really the idea that it's improving things comes only at the level of unity in homogeneity. For as long as we need a completely unique point of view to dominate the others, and when I say that, it's not it's not deprecating. In many situations, if you do not have a commonality of perception and sense making, it will be very difficult to react to a situation. If people are drowning, like the boat is sinking, but half the people are sure nothing's happening, it will be difficult to access the lifeboats and whatnot. You need to create a commonality of perception and understanding so that there could be a commonality of action or reaction or response. But at the same time, if you ignore completely the points of view and the uniqueness of each perspective, each narrative, you're basically negating the process of existence, this process of unfolding of diversity, and this process of unfolding of diversity, of dots, of points of beingness linked together by these lines, processes, flows, actions into an overarching unity of perception, consciousness. If you try to resort to a complete translation of everything into your own language and your own perspective and your own narrative for the sake of either making sure you hold the power and the world will adapt to your way of thinking, or making sure that everybody accesses the power given by your narrative. So it could be many very good reasons to motivate something like colonization or imperialism. But at the same time, from the other point of view, you're creating an impoverishment of the world. You're just negating otherness to support your identity. And over time, due to the actual working of the entire process, otherness is the only thing that can compensate for the unavoidable biases, drifts, and excesses and after effects or secondary effects of anything. You need the other, and especially you need your opposite to see what's in your back, what's in your shadow. So what's in the unconscious part of your unknowing, or what's in your drift as you move through the waves. Without the others, without otherness, there's no counterbalancing. So this idea of the line brings us also the line with a center point, gives us the balancing act, the pendulum, and the scales. We saw that the relationality between points gave us the ratio. Like one of the ratio is 1:1. It's balance point. If I shift ever so slightly, it will lean into one side. When it leans into one side, either I let go of any control and it falls, so it loses its relationality to the center, or I need access to the opposite part, the opposite half of the line, or the opposite point of the polarity. So polarity is a duality resolved by a third point. So either uniting whole or in between point, a middle point, or meeting point, contact point. So it moves from duality to polarity this way. I'm falling one way. I need to regain balance to move the other way. For as long as I'm recovering, it seems as though the movement on the other side is the only good movement. Any increase in the movement this way will increase the fall. So I recover. But since I kept this idea that this movement is the only good movement, I keep going. And now I lean in the other direction, and eventually I fall if I do not have access to both the other complementary opposite point and all the in-middle points, all the nuances. If these are answers, I can conserve things or I can change things. If I lean completely into the conservative aspect, there's precious little change allowed in my society or in myself. So now all the drifts and biases of conservation, order, static aspects will pile and create self-amplifying circles. If I go directly the other way, I'll get the same problem. I cannot go one way then to another the way a switch does. This will not allow me to navigate. I can go, like, it has many practical applications obviously, but we need to understand that the use of in a punctual time, I can just go one way or the other, and I can go one way to the extreme or one way to another level, like less or less or less. So in a point of time there can be only one answer applied, even though, as we will see later, you can have many layers of different movements superimposed upon each other. But if I consider the continuity, like the line of time, then the navigation of this river of time will imply the use of both alternatives and all the nuances, all the spectrum of nuances in between. Because if you lose your balance slightly on your bike and you're counteracting by going full on in the other direction, you'll fall. You need to be able to match the stimuli or the stress to the response so that you can keep a balance. And keeping a balance too, if you get to perfect balance while biking, you stop your bike. So keeping the balance implies also this concept of unbalanced balance. So balancing into a dynamic movement. So now let's get back to lines. As far as lines of perception, I can stretch my sight to the horizon. I can retract it, so get the idea of stretching two lines of sight as far as you can, then bringing it closer and closer to your eyes or getting it inside. You could drag your perception inwards, or the feeling of your perception inwards. So this is something we'll see many times. You can use the practical physical application of something, and you can use and move the feeling of something. Obviously, I cannot see inside my skull. At least me, I cannot. But I can move the feeling of seeing, that I can feel in my eyes, or I can feel in this part of my brain related to it. I can shift the feeling and move it somewhere else. So that's what we get when we say it. You move the feeling of seeing somewhere. It's exactly the same thing we saw last time with the point expanding. I can have a pressure somewhere. I can push away the pressure, stretch against it and fight it. I can submit to it and let it go, follow it. But I can also get this feeling and stretch the feeling of pressure on a plane. I could stretch it on a line, then two lines of 90-degree angle define a plane. Then I can stretch it and distribute it on a plane. I can stretch it to the extremities of distribute it evenly. If I get the pain there, I can stretch the feeling of the pain and the feeling of pressure. It's difficult for you to see, but I am actually pushing more and more and more. If I do nothing, it becomes not very pleasant. If I stretch, due to all these effects we saw, physical effects, mental effects, emotional effects, the physical effect, by stretching I increase the surface tension of the skin. By spreading and evening out the pressures inside. Once the pressure is equal, it will not allow for the invasion of one pressure. In the same way, if I brought more pressure, it would push away the thing. So we can use the form aspect, the energy aspect, or the mind aspect in each practical application. Stretching lines, spreading lines sideways, stretching lines in a frontal dimension, stretching it upwards. I extend the line of perception. When I combine both, I stretch a plane. When I put three lines in relation to each other, I define the three dimensions of space. Then I stretch a volume. If I include another dimension with the sequence of changes in this volume, I can stretch a volume and its changes in time. I can align things. I can move my entire body by shifting an axis that I defined inside myself. And again, it can be a physical axis, say your spine. You move all points of the spine at the same time, or you move the spine as one unit of segment or line if you stretch it into infinity. The way to train it can be, for instance, to use a stick, and you extend the stick forward until it stretches your fascia. Your fascia will take your bones and your structure, and then you can drive yourself from this feeling. If you stretch your arms via the ligaments, like you stretch too much, you miss the point when the fascia stick together the structure, and you get into stretching ligaments and tendons more. Then it does not apply the movement to my structure. I need to get stuck into into the bag, like this elastic wrapping of the fascia. And from there, what I do here will apply directly. So applications of lines, compressing, stretching, with another point, bending and stretching, two common uses of the body. I can have my hand loose, I can stretch it by making lines. I take two opposite points, I move them away from each other. When I do this stretching, when I discover how much I can stretch from what happens when I release all stretching, I start to create this idea of tuning, of accord. Like I can match a specific tension to a specific effect. The way if you stretch a string, it will change the size of the small undulations that the string can take, and it will change the frequency of the sound that it will make. So the same principle applies. You get your axis. Once you know how to extend or compress your axis, you can make the wavelength shorter or longer, and you can tune yourself for practical uses. If I take 5 strings in my body, so the central string linking the column and the head, the lateral lines getting to shoulder, hip joints, knees, feet. So these are the 2 practical real support structures of the body. I can link them to my arms. If I stretch completely, then the columns go from the top of the fingers to the tip of the toe, and the tip of the toe would be a spread, would be the line forking and keeping forward. Other one, the vertical line goes right through either the heel or depending on where your weight arrives on your foot, base of the foot, like the arch of the foot closer to the toes. And from these lines, I can direct one way or the other. So if I stretch more towards the sky, I release the pressure and friction on the ground, and I can ease movement. If in the other way I stretch downwards, then I increase pressure, I increase friction of my feet on the ground, and I prevent or I make movement more difficult. I can do the same by moving on a line, my weight for instance. I can feel where my mass is concentrated into, you can picture it as cities. You have a lot of matter in your head, so it's one center. You have quite a fair bit in your chest, would be another center. You have a lot in the meeting point of the belly and the hip joints, the pelvic belt. So where you have most weight, most units, most of mass, the biggest number of dots, you have a city. This city can be moved one way or another. I can move the center of mass of the lower part of my body down and increase my stability, my adherence to the ground. I lower my gravity center, making me harder to throw, to push and whatnot. if I do the opposite movement and I elevate my gravity center, I release pressure and friction on the sole of my feet, and I'm easier to unbalance, but I'm also easier to move. So if I'm moving myself, say that I'm running, dancing or whatnot, it's very common to use this upward movement to allow for more mobility. And there again, when you're more experienced, you can stretch both ways. So you can both stretch down or sink down and stretch up. So now the linear movements can be related to practical analogies. So one downward movement is called dropping. I hold something and I let it drop. The alignment is just done by the weight at the tip slowly aligning with the line of gravity. I can do the opposite movement and throw. So now what you see with the throw, you'll have a point of alignment with the line of gravity, but the vector force goes mostly downwards, although all mass attract each other. It's relative to the amount of mass. So one huge capital with a huge concentration of matter, energy, information, power, whatnot, drags towards it more of the business, more of the people. It's more attractive than a smaller center. So once it reaches, when I throw it, it reaches the alignment, it will fall on the other side. So what we saw too from the dropping, the pendulum movement is the decrease in angular motion and sort of wavelength. So if you picture this as a graph, the wavelength is decreasing in time until it finds its alignment with gravity. It's dissipating residual energy until it gets to another point of balance. So now I can do these linear movements in myself. I can stretch, keep control, and stretch by fixing one part and moving another, moving two parts, moving from the inside out, moving from the outside in, starts at the extremity and reaches the center. I can sink. So sinking would be this idea of releasing gradually. There's a letting go effect, but it's now I have to simulate it because this sticks too much. But it's, see, I do it like this. This is the sinking feeling. It's flowing down. But there's a modicum of control. You release sand, you lose control over units of sand, but not on the entire content at one point. You release gradually a rope, same. And the rope, you keep control of the entirety of the rope by the link between each unit. But it's basically the same content. I can throw my weight down, like release. That's very, very dangerous in some ways. Like if you fix one part of the body and sink, you'll get this feeling of weight weighing down. It's one good way of realigning the body too. That's stuck by tension. I release, and then it gets closer to the line of gravity. You can contract and release, which is using what we saw with the dot ID. You concentrate, you bring more control, more density, and then you release, make it loose, and you use this flow along a line, and the coincidence of one line, the line of structural line of your body with the line of energy of the vector force of gravity, to realign. So this realignment is not only a realignment of points, it can be realigning several lines together. If you think of all the flows in fluid dynamics, so you have laminar flows going in parallel lines, and then turbulent flows will start to make small gyres to accelerate some of the movements. So you have many applications. For now, aligning, stretching, compressing. Take two lines, compress them, getting closer together. Release, stretching, release. So there we have these ideas to active movement, passive movement. And you can have active and passive movements in all directions. I hold something, I release it, passive movement. I throw it, active movement. Although the active movement will be turned into passive phase, there's still a big difference into what's being done. I can shape my line to serve purposes. I need to enclose something, I wrap my line. Say my finger of my arm is a line, I need to wrap around something. Many different ways to do it. You can get a whip-like effect by using, I create a wavelength into a flexible line, like a string, a whip, something, and when it reaches, it wraps. When it wraps, it folds around and drags. So that's the Indiana Jones style. Several other applications would obviously be found, but for now that will suffice. You can train aligning your own body parts. I do a lot of physical work forward, and then my structure will lean, will change, as we saw, will change no more in an elastic manner, but in a plastic manner. I need to realign it. I stretch outwards until my two shoulders align with the center behind my sternum. And I can align several. I make the cross. The cross is the symbol of vertical relationship of scales and horizontal relationship of reach, spread, width, depth. So you can stretch all these ways, you can compress all these ways, you can move a point on a line, you can move a line on a point. All the ideas of levers and whatnot. Levers, pulley, which is a lever on a lever with a non-rigid object. So I'll elaborate a bit more on this next time.